Okay, so what we're going to do here is go through exercise one, basically, or lab number one, which is where we're going to actually start using the database, the MySQL database that we've stood up and is operating on your machine. All right, so let's kind of let's walk through. I want to walk through kind of the description of this, of what's in lab one. Um, and kind of explain what we're going to be doing before we actually get into it. Okay, so to start off with, first thing we need to do, and I think we've been working on this over the past class or so, is download and install the MySQL using the installation procedure. So we're going to assume for Lab 1 at this point that we have a working MySQL database and workbench on your machine. All right. So Lab 1 is our first, where we're going to be first using this, is really focusing on defining the database and the tables that are associated with the database. All right. So the one thing to remember is, there's a sequence of what we're installing. So the first step is we've installed the MySQL system itself, the software, the relational database system, right, which is the software that's going to be that runs all the database stuff for us. All right, so that's step one. All right. Once we create the database, there's nothing in, excuse me, once we create the server, there's nothing in the server. All right, there's some system stuff, but there's no, we have to go through an exercise where we're going to have to create the database. All right. And then once we create a database, what we're going to do is then go into that particular database, all right, and then create a bunch of tables. All right. So we look here. So the exercise we're looking at, the scenario we're looking at, is to create a sales system, create a database that describes all of the things you need to do if you're going to be working with sales. All right. So there's a bunch of components. If you look at it as we talking from our modeling, as the result, as the outcome of our modeling, as we've gone through this stuff, we've done analysis for what we need, the types of things we need to have in order to create a sales application. All right, so coming out of that analysis process, so we're assuming for this lab we've done that analysis and we've defined all the tables. We know what we're going to do. So this is going to be an exercise in doing it. All right. So a couple things we're going to do. So we're going to create an address table. All right. We're going to create a city table. We're going to create a country table. Going to create a customer table, as well as an inventory table, an order table, a payment table, a staff table, and finally a store table. All right. So in order to put together an application that handles sales, we've identified these 9 different, using our relational definitional stuff. These are the entities. All right. So there are 9 entities, each of which have a set of attributes, which will translate to 9 tables, which have sets of fields associated with them. All right. So let's look at the first one. So first one we're going to do the address table. All right. So it's address information. Contains all the information we need for customers, staff, and stores. All right. There's a relationship with this um, where we're going to connect the address table to the customer, staff, and store tables. All right. And the columns, or the fields, we're going to define for this is an address ID, which is going to be basically what we call a surrogate key, but basically it's going to be a unique number that's going to make every row unique. It's going to be a sequential number that's going to make every row in the table unique, so we can ascribe to the entity. What do we call it? From a relationship perspective, basically the entity integrity. All right, so we're going to make sure every row it has a unique key to it. So that's this address ID. Then we'll have address, 2 lines of address and address 2, a district, a city ID, a postal code, the phone number, and the last time the row was created or most recently updated. All right, so these are the fields we're going to create when we do this table. All right. So, and if you look here, what we have is a command. This is the example of the command we're going to enter. All right, so it's going to be create table address, address ID, and some parameters that go with, so small int, which tells us what the what type of field it's going to be, whether it's signed, unsigned, not null, auto increment. So what an auto increment means is that an auto increment means it will generate the next time a row gets entered, it will insert the next sequential number in that field. So the first one would be 0, the second one would be 1, third one would be 2, so on and so forth. All right. Address, a variable character they call varchar 50. So it's a 50. It's a 50 character. You would read this as a 50 character field. All right, not null. And when we say not null, means it has, the rule is around that there has to be something entered. All right. So if you see a not null, that's a required field. If we look at address 2 is a varchar 50, same kind of field. It does not have a not null on it. So what that means is you don't have to enter address 2. You have to enter address 1. You don't have to enter address 2. All right. And then we go through the rest of them. So we have district, city ID, which is not null. So these are required. Postal code, city ID, postal code. Phone is a variable. Last update is also required. And then we define it, the primary key. Then what we do is we have a parameter here. It says, okay, the primary key is going to be the address ID field. All right, so this is a definition of the address table, the first of our 9 tables that we're going to be working with here. Okay, so let's go to the workbench. All right, so I'm on a Macintosh. All right, so my definition here is going to look a little bit different if you're on Windows. All right, but basically the function of it works pretty much the same. All right, so as we're doing this, all right, take a look over here. We've got this column here. It says schemas. Right, so what the schemas are? The schema is really the definition of the database. All right, remember what will happen is when we first install it, the only schema we're going to see is this sys schema, all right, which is the system schema for the server itself. All right, so it's stuff that the server needs to do. All right, there's no working table in there. All right. So what we have to do is, so we basically, what we're going to do is we have to enter commands, all right, which when they're executed, the database management system will take the commands, interpret what we want, and then do it on our behalf. All right, so and assuming we enter the commands correctly, we will get a result. All right. So how do we go about that? So what we want to do is, if you take a look at the top up here, we have a whole bunch of different kind of icons. All right. So this one right here is connection to the DBMS. So what this is going to be if you are, remember there's 2 parts to the system. So there's the workbench part, which we're on right now. And then behind the scenes, which running on the system, running on your machine is the actual server itself. So what you have to do is you have to make sure you have a connection operating between your workbench here and the back-end server. So the way you do that, you would just simply do a reconnect and would reestablish communication with it. All right. All right, so there's a bunch of other icons up here. The ones we're going to be most interested in, and we'll kind of describe all of these as we go along. But for our first exercise here, we want to go to this first icon here. It says SQL, all right? And what it says is, the definition of this is, when you click this, create a new SQL tab for executing queries. All right? So I'm going to click that, all right? And we're going to get something that looks like this. All right? So this is basically the interface where we will interact with the database management system. We're going to enter commands. We will enter, the the SQL commands, which is the language. We'll talk more about the language of this, but for purposes of right now, where we're at is just to get started. SQL is the language we use to communicate between, we talk to the DBMS and the DBMS figures out what we want and brings back the results out of the database. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is, we don't have a database, so we're going to create, if we go back to what we're going to do here, what we want to do is we want to create a database named sales. All right. And then we'll use that database and define all these other tables we've got. So let's start with that. That's going to be our first step in this process here. All right. So what I'm going to do is, the way I create a database is on our command, create database. And then I'm going to put the name of the database. All right. And I'm going to follow, at the end of every command, I'm going to put a semicolon. Right? That's how I'm going to end my command. That's how the database server is going to know that I'm done. I'm done entering, and I can execute this. All right. Now I can press return, and it's not going to do anything. All right. It's basically going to keep moving down the line here. All right. So what I'm going to do here, though, I want to execute this. So what you do is you enter the command, you put the semicolon, and what you want to do is execute it. So this icon right here, it says execute. All right, so I'm going to execute that. All right, and what I'm going to do is, and what you'll see at the bottom is, you'll see basically what the results of that are. Okay, if it works successfully, you'll get a green check. All right. If you don't enter, if it doesn't work successfully, you'll get a red check or a red X. All right. So I've created the database sales, so it's out there. Now, if I go and I execute this again, what it's going to do is it's going to come back and it says, hey, guess what? You've already got a database. You create another database with the same name. All right. So now what we have is we have the sales database, which is really an empty database. There were no tables in that database. And actually, if we recreate, let's see what happens if I refresh this. What we'll see is now we have a new database, and it has a whole bunch of things that are out here. They're empty, so there's no tables, there's no views, there's no stored procedures, there's no functions. It's basically an empty. It's a database, but it's an empty database. All right, so the second step we want to do is we want to be able to select it, because if you take a look, I've got multiple databases. So I've got something called first DB, I've got a second DB, and I have sales. So in order to work with a particular database, we're going to use a command. All right, and that's going to be the use command. The format of the use command is we type in use and the name of the database. I'm going to execute that. Boom, you see we got a green tag on that one. So use sales. So what I've done is I'm now set to use the sales database. All right, so any commands I enter now are going to be applied against that database versus the first or second databases. All right, so I've got this out here. So let's go back to our lab exercise paper here. And as you see, we have a bunch of commands here. All right, so what we can do is, and this is all legitimate, this is SQL, a working SQL definition. So let's copy and paste it. All right, so I'm going to just basically highlight. I'm going to highlight and cut and paste this chunk of SQL. So starting from the create table command at the top, create table address, down to the primary key, ending with the semicolon, I'm going to copy that. Okay, I'm going to go back to our workbench, and I'm going to paste it. So all I've done is I've just done a cut and paste of that definition into our database here, or into our basically, or into the SQL query sheet. And then what I'm going to do is going to execute that. Well, let's see what it says. I got 2 warnings, but it did execute. So it's a warning, but it was not a failure. All right, so let's do a refresh of the schema. Let's look at the tables, and you'll see now we have an address table. And if I click this, now I see my columns. I see my indexes. There's no index. There's a primary index by default. When you create the key, when you pick the primary key, it'll create an index for that. All right, no foreign keys. No triggers. Now, one of the warnings is, my suspicion is the warnings are there may be some dependencies on some other tables that aren't quite out there yet, but it's just simply a warning, not failure. All right, so right now, so what we've done so far is we've created a database. We've said use the database, and now we are going to, our next step is going to be, we'll just do the next one, one at a time. So we'll just do a delete. We'll go back over, so we've got address. Let's go down. Let's create the city table. Same process. We do a Control C to copy it. All right. We'll go back to our workbench, and we will paste this in. No, we've got to take the example out. I took one too many. What you'll see is if you see something that is incorrect, what will happen is if you've got something that's incorrect, like one of the things that my SQL workbench will do is it'll check for syntax. If it's correct, it'll be okay. And if there's something incorrect, something that is not correct in terms of the way the format is supposed to be, and it doesn't recognize and it's not legitimate, what it'll do is it'll give you a red mark there. All right, so let's execute this. Click that. All right. Created the city table. Also got a warning on that, but it should be good. If I refresh my schema, we now have 2 tables. And so on, and so on, and so on. So we can go through this. So the first exercise, or for the first lab 1, what we're going to do is basically going through this, one at a time with all these examples, and we're going to cut and paste. So it's kind of a cut and paste exercise. Country, same thing. We do a refresh of our schema. What we'll see is we will see our tables. So we've got address, city table, and so on and so forth as we go down the line. Now, the thing to remember is the tables themselves are empty. We haven't put any data in them yet. All right? So all we're doing is we're defining it, and they're empty. So you start off with you create the server. The sequence is to install the server, create an empty database. Within that database, we will add tables, add empty tables. And then once we've loaded all of the empty tables, we will then go back and we will load data into those tables. All right. So there's a couple sequences we have to do. We have to go through we're going to have to go through a couple steps on this, because remember we said databases are all built around rules. So we need to define the rules and then apply the data which matches the rules and loads everything in. All right. So that is pretty much, so that's the exercise. So the rest of this stuff is going to be pretty much an example of continuing to cut and paste country. Now what will happen is after those are the first 4 examples. All right. Now so it's not a total cut and paste. What we need to do is we will for the customer table, we're going to create. What I want you to do is to go back and create this the actual SQL. So what you can do is you can use these as a template. All right. So we have what the field names are. All right. We have what the field names are. So what we'll have to do though is translate that into, so this will be, create table customer with a customer ID. So that would probably be the same. Store ID, first name, last name, address ID. Basically these are the field names we want to put in there. For the most part, you'll keep these as you kind of read what the description is and whether or not these things have to be, whether they're required. If they say they're required, we put a not null in. If they don't have to be, if they're not required, we can just leave. We can leave the not null out, and then define what the primary key. So the last thing we will enter is the primary key will be, in this case, it'll be the customer ID. All right. For the inventory table, it'll be inventory ID. All right. So what we'll do is we will create these last 4 or 5 definitions, execute them, and then create the table associated with that. All right. So that's really so this is what Lab 1 is all about. This is what we're going to be working our way through uh, the next class or so. All right. That's about it for this.